welcome back to my channel. This is a conscious media series, and I'm going to be discussing one of the episodes from Soulmates. And this specific one, it's packed with so many different themes, from grief, change, resistance to change, religion, spiritual bypassing, love, soulmates, the idea of soulmates, what we invest in it. I feel like I could take it in so many different ways. It's just such an intense episode to watch as well, and I feel like it can play in some themes of power and authority, and if you had some trauma from those things or from things related to religion, it can also be triggering in some way. But I'm just going to focus on the idea of change and this specific clip that really stuck with me from the whole episode. It's a little bit of a spoiler, might be. So if you haven't watched it, I recommend watching the episode first and then maybe coming back to this.
When I was at the clinic, and the nurses told me Heather was dead, I was relieved. Because if she was alive, then I might actually have to do something. Go find her. Be somewhere that she might actually... Well, I found out who she was. And all these things that she done, just... I told myself... Well, maybe she was calling me. Maybe I was just scared of doing something.
So, it is pretty intense, but it's also what struck me the most is that, and I want to say it's almost a human condition where we go so far towards in something, for like in resistance to something, to changing something, coming to such a tipping point where we actually confront the reality and we are ready to change something. And in that specific clip, it's so telling. It's like, how far would you take it? And it's like you're taking it in this whole roundabout, but really, maybe it was just you resisting the change. And I think that was the most powerful part of this episode for me. It just made me think about how change is a difficult process for all of us in some way. And I mean, change management is its own big topic and discipline in business, and I kind of started looking into it, and I found that there's a lot of interesting stuff in it, and actually it made me think deeper into this. Like, for instance, there is a change management model developed by a social psychologist, Ekchart, and it's a 3-step model, and basically there are phases which is defined, and I just found the language super interesting. It goes: unfreeze the organization, move of the organization to where it needs to be, and then refreeze an organization into the new model. So the language of freezing and freezing, I found it really interesting because first of all, it kind of corresponds to like a survival responses that we all have, and one of them being fight, flight, and there is also freeze, and that idea of like almost a certain stuckness, and then to stay in something you almost like need to refreeze it. I find that really interesting, and it just made me think about the flexibility and I guess more so inflexibility of human psyche. Connecting it to my favorite paper, I feel like I connect everything to it, but it is so applicable here, by Judith Butler, who wrote about was it gender? Basically, she wrote about the unconscious repetition of gender and how it's all just like our psyche is just repeating what's known. And the way she describes it is just it's so powerful because it kind of shows that inner mechanism of stuckness and repetition. Yeah, so a little more specifically, she writes about gender. Yeah, it's about gender constitution, performative acts and gender constitution, and she writes how gender is in no way a stable identity or locus of agency from which various acts proceed, that it's an identity tenuously constituted in time, an identity instituted through a stylized repetition of acts. And I think to me it means a little bit different, I guess, to what the contemporary culture is trying to move towards in the sense of binary, non-binary, because I feel like, again, there is a certain repetition and stuckness in labels and what the labels mean, and when you create a certain definition of that in a society versus recognizing that we are just repeating and that there is an infinite number of possibilities of what actually could emerge and happen. But this is a whole other topic, not to go too much into that. I think what's interesting in relation to here and in relation to change is how much we have that mechanism, a pattern in our mind, on the subconscious mind, that is playing something out. And I feel like that moment in this episode was so profound in a way, the fact that that awareness came to him in a sense like, you know what, it's almost like realizing that his whole love and mourning was almost performative. It was a performative act by himself to himself in order to prevent him from changing his life. And that's, in a way, it's like, it's astonishingly amazing how much we can create that kind of performance for ourselves to either, I wouldn't say prevent us from doing something, but now I'm also recognizing that it's not even so much about preventing us from doing something, but continuing to, and I think that's what maybe Freud would say, or yeah, like from a psychoanalytic perspective, I think it's continuing to identify with something else that is serving us in a way of staying the same and not changing things. And I really feel like that paper by Freud, Mourning and Melancholia, I think it is. Yeah, so in Freud's view, it's like that differentiation between mourning and melancholia is really interesting because it kind of portrays or talks about that narcissistic identification of the ego and impoverishment of the ego on a grand scale. That's how he words it. So in mourning, it's the world that becomes poor and empty. In melancholia, it's the ego itself. And basically, he explains is that that's precisely what leads to something whether psychologically very remarkable, an overcoming of the instinct which compels every living thing to cling to life. And I guess there he means that kind of a state of depression which leads to basically not wanting to leave, right? And I guess in Freud's view, it's something like you, yourself, your psyche, the ego turned against itself. And in that paper, he explains it a little bit more in depth, in a sense that it's that kind of hatred. I think he uses the words hatred and sadism. That is kind of self-sadistic impulses and pleasure. And that's what I guess he means here, in a sense of impoverishment of the ego. Whereas the interesting different explanation, but I think it talks to the same thing and very much is the same thing, is by Ekchart Tolle, who is more of a spiritual teacher, I would say, than a psychologist or like psychoanalyst, of course. He talks about the pain body and calls it a dark shadow cast by the ego that is afraid of the light of your consciousness. It's afraid of being found out. Its survival depends on your unconscious identification with it, as well as unconscious fear of facing the pain that lives in you. It's very much similar in a way of that there is some kind of identification that is happening, but I think for Tolle it's a little bit more, I think in his sense ego means maybe a little bit different than to Freud, in a sense that ego is something that is happening almost like separately from the true self. I think that the divide there is stronger, and it just makes me think about how different those terms became right now in the contemporary use and in the spiritual world when we talk about ego. And maybe that's why there is also a little bit of that, I want to say, demonization in a way, because in this specific example, of like Freud talking about ego, like ego turning on itself and impoverishment of the ego is really a bad thing, because it can lead to that kind of depressive things and no desire to leave, basically. So that's where I'm always kind of careful with those terms and what does they actually mean, but I do feel like it's a good example from Ekchart Tolle and the idea of unconscious identification and fear of being found out, because as we see in that same clip, it's like when you found out, you confront the reality, and the reality is that you actually realize you're not living the life that you want to live, and through that realization you understand that there is so much you need to do and change, and there's probably a lot of other deeper things in it of why you don't want to do it, why you find it hard to do it, and so on and so on. And this is another thing that leaves it a little bit unclear and up in the air when it comes to movies or like TV shows and stuff. We are seeing a certain glimpse, and not to spoil it too much, but we are seeing a certain glimpse of a happy ending of how it is going to be. But the truth is, even in those glimpses of consciousness, of those moments of profound insight and realization, I think there should be an important recognition that it takes a lot of work, and I feel like in that way we're given a super unrealistic perspective in film and movies and overall just about how those happy endings come about, how does one actually go out and change his life, because you would imagine having such a profound experience would force you to do something, but at the same time it's not necessarily like, it's kind of like you wake up and you fall back asleep again. I remember reading the lines of a book, can't remember what was the book now, but I remember like the very first lines or it was a spiritual book, and it was like, when we awaken, can we wake up a little bit more? And it's something that stuck with me, because I feel like we can, and also we're not truly ever awaken. It's like we wake up and we fall back asleep, and that's what happens all the time. And I think we just get better at waking up. We can get better at waking up, maybe more often, and for longer periods of time. But I don't think it's something about the level of wokeness, so to say. And I think this is also where terminology and language really gets messy, because what does it mean to be awake, woke? I roll my eyes at that, just because of the popular culture and the way it's kind of portrayed, in the sense that it's not about your intellectual knowledge or knowledge of like how much polluted our water is and all other things. I mean, it's amazing if you're using your mind to critically think and maybe change your life and take care of your body and stuff, but it's not about that, and it's not about shouting all these stories, all those theories to somebody else, or trying to convince somebody else to live life in a certain way. I think it's just more of that conscious awareness of what is happening to you in the moment. Are you living the life that you want to live? Like that awareness of, are you like unconsciously identifying and kind of living on this dark shadow of your ego or whatever else it is, right? Or are you actually living an authentic life? And again, I think an authenticity here also cannot be defined as in like, yeah, I'm actually working the job of my dreams and stuff like that. I think authenticity is really you versus you. It's not somebody else can ever define for you. It's really that inner knowing of like, this is true. This is really true. And I think on some level, watching the journey of this guy in the episode, and I think we could probably all find, maybe not to such an extreme of course, but we could all probably find those moments of this word comes to mind, like a whale, and reminds me of there is a word from like yogic philosophy, Maya. So it's kind of, and it refers to that duality of an ego and how that can kind of filter your world. But I really like the word whale, because it's kind of whale because it's kind of like overshadowing what you see. It's not like you're not in reality. It's, the reality is always there. It's always at the background. Like what is true is always kind of there. And I think on some level, despite like watching this and you might feel like somebody's so drawn into believe in something, like you have to be, right, to go to such a far extent. But at the same time, you always know at the background what is the truth. It's just that whole resistance and that whole unconscious conflict is so strong that your unconscious awareness is able to overpower what you truly know. And that's, I think, amazing on so many levels, in a sense of you realize how much power there is in our subconscious mind, and how important it is to, I guess, do this kind of work, to examine our thoughts, to not just live a life that is, I don't know, it's hard to define, right? Like, I don't want to be like, I would say not to live a life blindfolded in a way. Maybe like live a life with your eyes open. I think that's probably the most important thing there is. Thank you for watching. I hope this was informative, and yeah, and I hope it will help you to move closer towards change too. Thank you.